Hey everyone, welcome back to Threads of Kindness, where we explore stories of truth, resilience, and unexpected twists. Today's episode brings you two gripping narratives: a neighborhood feud that spirals into police involvement, ending in a dramatic arrest, and a shocking tale of betrayal as an engineer uncovers a years-long scam tied to his name. From false accusations to long overdue reckonings, these stories remind us of the importance of standing up for what's right. Let's jump in. It was an early Sunday morning, and David Harper was enjoying a rare day off. As a former lead systems engineer for Precision Tech Solutions, he had spent nearly 2 decades designing cutting-edge industrial machinery before moving on to a quieter life. Now working in a different field, he had left behind the high-pressure deadlines and constant demands of his old career. But that peaceful existence was shattered when his personal phone rang at 7 a.m. David frowned at the unknown number flashing on the screen. He rarely got calls on this phone. It was reserved for family and close friends. Hesitating for a moment, he decided to pick up, fearing it might be an emergency. "Hello, this is David," he answered, his voice still groggy from sleep. "Mr. Harper," came the urgent voice on the other end. "This is Mark Reynolds, the plant manager at Global Works Manufacturing. We have a serious problem and we need your help immediately." David sat up in bed, fully awake now. Global Works Manufacturing? The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it right away. Before he could ask for clarification, Mark continued in a rushed tone. "The system you designed, it's completely down. The entire plant is at a standstill. We can't produce anything, and it's costing us thousands every hour. If this isn't fixed by tomorrow, we'll lose contracts worth millions," Mark said, the desperation in his voice unmistakable. Confused, David replied, "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake. I don't work for Precision Tech anymore, and I haven't been involved with that system for years. How did you even get this number?" Mark hesitated, then dropped a bombshell that left David stunned. "This is the number we were given by your former colleague, Alan Briggs, for emergency tech support. We've been paying him an annual fee for years to ensure we had access to you if anything went wrong." David's heart sank as the implications of Mark's words began to sink in. Alan Briggs, a former senior salesperson at Precision Tech, had somehow taken his personal phone number and used it to scam Global Works into believing they had a legitimate support agreement. Worse, Briggs had pocketed the money without David's knowledge or consent. "I don't work with Alan Briggs or Precision Tech anymore," David said firmly. "I'm not involved in any support agreements, and this is my personal number. I'm not even in the industry anymore." Mark was silent for a moment, then let out a frustrated sigh. "Look, I understand this isn't your problem, but we're in a critical situation here. You designed the system, and you're the only one who knows it inside out. Is there any way you can help us?" David rubbed his temples, torn between frustration and sympathy. He had no obligation to assist, especially after learning how his personal information had been misused. But the thought of an entire plant grinding to a halt and the livelihoods of its workers hanging in the balance struck a chord. "All right," David said after a long pause. "I can't come to the plant, but I'll try to walk you through some troubleshooting steps over the phone. This is only because I don't want your team to suffer because of someone else's mistakes." Relief flooded Mark's voice. "Thank you, Mr. Harper. I really appreciate it." It was an early Sunday morning, and David Harper was enjoying a rare day off. As a former lead systems engineer for Precision Tech Solutions, he had spent nearly 2 decades designing cutting-edge industrial machinery before moving on to a quieter life. Now working in a different field, he had left behind the high-pressure deadlines and constant demands of his old career. But that peaceful existence was shattered when his personal phone rang at 7 a.m. David frowned at the unknown number flashing on the screen. He rarely got calls on this phone. It was reserved for family and close friends. Hesitating for a moment, he decided to pick up, fearing it might be an emergency. "Hello, this is David," he answered, his voice still groggy from sleep. "Mr. Harper," came the urgent voice on the other end. "This is Mark Reynolds, the plant manager at Global Works Manufacturing. We have a serious problem and we need your help immediately." David sat up in bed, fully awake now. Global Works Manufacturing? The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it right away. Before he could ask for clarification, Mark continued in a rushed tone. "The system you designed, it's completely down. The entire plant is at a standstill. We can't produce anything, and it's costing us thousands every hour. If this isn't fixed by tomorrow, we'll lose contracts worth millions," Mark said, the desperation in his voice unmistakable. Confused, David replied, "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake. I don't work for Precision Tech anymore, and I haven't been involved with that system for years. How did you even get this number?" Mark hesitated, then dropped a bombshell that left David stunned. This is the number we were given by your former colleague, Alan Briggs, for emergency tech support. We've been paying him an annual fee for years to ensure we had access to you if anything went wrong." David's heart sank as the implications of Mark's words began to sink in. Alan Briggs, a former senior salesperson at Precision Tech, had somehow taken his personal phone number and used it to scam Globalworks into believing they had a legitimate support agreement. Worse, Briggs had pocketed the money without David's knowledge or consent. "I don't work with Alan Briggs or Precision Tech anymore," David said firmly. "I'm not involved in any support agreements, and this is my personal number. I'm not even in the industry anymore." Mark was silent for a moment, then let out a frustrated sigh. "Look, I understand this isn't your problem, but we're in a critical situation here. You designed the system, and you're the only one who knows it inside out. Is there any way you can help us?" David rubbed his temples, torn between frustration and sympathy. He had no obligation to assist, especially after learning how his personal information had been misused. But the thought of an entire plant grinding to a halt and the livelihoods of its workers hanging in the balance struck a chord. "All right," David said after a long pause. "I can't come to the plant, but I'll try to walk you through some troubleshooting steps over the phone. This is only because I don't want your team to suffer because of someone else's mistakes." Relief flooded Mark's voice. "Thank you, Mr. Harper. I really appreciate it." For the next 30 minutes, David guided Mark through a series of diagnostics, drawing on his memory of the system he had designed years ago. He outlined potential causes for the failure and suggested temporary fixes that might get the machinery running until proper repairs could be made. All the while, a nagging sense of betrayal gnawed at him. Alan Briggs had not only exploited David's expertise, but also placed him in an ethically and professionally compromising position. As they wrapped up the call, Mark expressed his gratitude once more. "You've done more than enough, Mr. Harper. I'm so sorry for dragging you into this, especially on your day off. I'll be taking this up with Alan Briggs first thing tomorrow." David ended the call and sat in silence, replaying the conversation in his mind. His frustration was no longer directed at Mark, but at Briggs and, by extension, Precision Tech Solutions. How had Alan gotten access to his private number? And why hadn't the company prevented this kind of breach? Determined to get answers, David decided he would contact his former employer on Monday morning. Whatever had happened, it was clear that Alan Briggs had crossed a line, and David wasn't about to let it slide. Monday morning arrived, and David Harper was ready to confront the storm brewing in his mind. As soon as the Precision Tech Solutions office opened, he placed a call to his former employer. After navigating through the automated phone system, he was finally connected to Laura Mason, the HR director who had been a steady presence during his years at the company. "David, it's been a while. How are you?" Laura greeted warmly. "Hi, Laura," David replied, skipping the pleasantries. "I'm calling because something serious has come to my attention. Yesterday, I received an emergency call from a plant manager at Globalworks Manufacturing. He said that Alan Briggs gave him my personal number for tech support and has been charging them a fee for years, claiming I was available 24/7. The line went quiet. Laura finally responded, her tone serious. "David, that's a major issue. Are you sure about this?" "Positive," David said, recounting the details of his conversation with Mark Reynolds. "Alan had my private phone number and even provided my home address as part of the supposed support agreement. The plant manager showed me proof of this in the service contract." Laura's voice tightened with concern. "Your personal information was only in your HR file, David. If Alan had access to it, this could be a significant breach of confidentiality and potentially illegal." "Exactly," David said. "I need to know how this happened, and I want Precision Tech to take action. This isn't just about me, it's about the trust of your clients and the integrity of the company." Laura assured David that she would escalate the matter to the company's leadership immediately. Within hours, David received a call from Eric Thompson, Precision Tech's managing director, a man who had once been his direct supervisor. Eric sounded both surprised and troubled as he asked David to recount the situation in detail. "David," Eric began after listening to the story, "this is deeply concerning. Alan Briggs left Precision Tech years ago, but if what you're saying is true, he exploited his position here to commit fraud. This breaches not only our policies, but also legal boundaries." Eric promised to launch an internal investigation and keep David informed of the findings. True to his word, the investigation moved quickly. Within 48 hours, the picture of Alan Briggs's betrayal began to crystallize. He had used his position as a senior salesperson to retain sensitive client records after leaving Precision Tech. In doing so, he had accessed David's private information, likely through an HR file or old email chain, and weaponized it to create a fraudulent tech support scheme. For years, Briggs had been collecting an annual fee from GlobalWorks Manufacturing under the guise of offering 24/7 emergency support. To maintain the illusion, he had included David's phone number in the service agreement, knowing full well that David was unaware of the arrangement. Worse, Briggs hadn't even provided the bare minimum of technical assistance. GlobalWorks had unknowingly operated their Precision Tech machinery for over a decade without proper maintenance, relying entirely on luck until the inevitable system failure occurred. The revelation shocked Precision Tech's leadership team. Not only had Briggs undermined their reputation with a long-standing client, but he had also placed them at risk of legal action. If GlobalWorks chose to sue, the damages could be catastrophic. Eric called David back later that week, his voice a mix of anger and apology. "David, I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am for what's happened. Alan acted entirely outside the bounds of his authority, but we take responsibility for failing to safeguard your information. This should never have happened." David appreciated the apology, but his focus remained on accountability. "What's being done to address this?" he asked. Eric explained that Precision Tech's legal team had already reached out to GlobalWorks to apologize and begin damage control. They assured the client that they would cover all repair costs for the system and offer a new support agreement, this time directly through the company. As for Alan Briggs, Eric revealed that the investigation had uncovered a trail of unethical behavior beyond this single incident. He had forged documents, misappropriated funds, and falsified agreements to line his pockets after leaving Precision Tech. "We're working with our legal counsel to pursue action against him," Eric said. "This includes recovering the fees he collected and ensuring he's held accountable for the breach of your information." David felt a sense of vindication, but he couldn't shake the lingering frustration. Alan's actions had put him in an unfair position, and the thought of his personal data being mishandled left a bitter taste. "Eric," David said, his voice firm, "make sure this never happens again. No employee should have to deal with what I've been through, and no client should have to question the company's integrity." "You have my word," Eric replied. "And David, thank you for bringing this to our attention. Your professionalism throughout this ordeal has been remarkable." Hanging up the phone, David felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The betrayal had been uncovered, but the damage Briggs had caused was far-reaching. Still, David knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of the fallout. Alan Briggs would soon face the consequences of his actions, and justice would finally be served. As the fallout from the investigation unraveled, the consequences for Alan Briggs were swift and severe. Within days of Precision Tech Solutions completing their internal review, their legal team filed formal complaints with the authorities, alleging fraud and breach of confidentiality. Alan's years of deceit had left a paper trail that was easy to follow, and the evidence was damning. Meanwhile, GlobalWorks Manufacturing, furious at being deceived, demanded restitution not only from Alan, but also considered holding Precision Tech partially accountable for allowing such a breach to occur. David Harper, though removed from the chaos, couldn't help but stay informed through colleagues who still worked at Precision Tech. One of them, Sarah, sent him a message. "You wouldn't believe what's happening. Briggs is in hot water with everyone. Word is, he's going to lose everything." Indeed, the fallout was monumental. Precision Tech's legal team presented Alan with a choice: settle the matter privately by paying significant damages to both GlobalWorks and Precision Tech, or face a public lawsuit for fraud, which could include criminal charges. Alan, knowing he stood little chance in court, chose the settlement. However, the damages were so large, covering years of fraudulent fees, lost productivity for GlobalWorks, and reputational harm to Precision Tech, that Alan was forced to liquidate his assets, including his home, to cover even part of the costs. But Alan's troubles didn't end there. The manufacturing industry is tight-knit, and news of his unethical behavior spread rapidly. Clients, suppliers, and even former colleagues turned their backs on him, unwilling to associate with someone whose actions had jeopardized so many. His fledgling business collapsed overnight, and he found himself blacklisted from an industry he had worked in for decades. Meanwhile, Precision Tech faced its own reckoning, though they had acted quickly to address the breach. Questions about their data security practices lingered. To restore client trust, they implemented stricter data protection protocols and hired a third-party firm to audit their internal systems. Additionally, they overhauled their HR policies to ensure that no former employee could access sensitive information. Eric Thompson, the managing director, personally reached out to every client affected by Alan's schemes, offering reparations and assurances that such an incident would never happen again. For David, the resolution brought mixed emotions. On one hand, he was gratified to see Alan Briggs held accountable. On the other, the experience left a lasting mark. He had been dragged into a mess he had no part in creating, forced to relive a chapter of his career he had long since closed. Despite the resolution, he felt a sense of unease knowing how easily his private information had been exploited. One day, Eric called David again, this time to update him on the final developments. "David, I wanted to let you know that we've fully resolved the matter with Global Works. They've accepted our settlement and agreed to renew their partnership with us under much stricter terms." "That's good to hear," David replied. "And Alan?" Eric sighed. "He's finished. Between the settlement and the reputational damage, I don't see him recovering. He's burned every bridge he had." David nodded, but something still bothered him. "What about the breach of my information? Was it Alan alone, or did someone at Precision Tech give him access?" Eric hesitated before responding. "We traced the breach back to an employee in HR who had a connection to Alan. They resigned the same day we confronted them. Rest assured, we've taken every step to ensure this won't happen again." It was a relief to know the source of the breach had been dealt with, but David couldn't help feeling that the damage had already been done. His private information had been compromised, and it had taken years for the truth to come to light. Still, he took solace in the fact that justice had prevailed and that his efforts to expose the issue had helped prevent further harm. Months later, David received one final call from Mark Reynolds at Global Works Manufacturing. This time, the tone was one of gratitude, not desperation. "David, I just wanted to thank you again for helping us when you didn't have to. You saved us from a disaster, and I'll never forget that." David smiled. "I'm glad I could help, Mark. Just make sure you work directly with Precision Tech from now on. No more middlemen." As he hung up, David reflected on the entire ordeal. It had been a whirlwind of deceit, betrayal, and accountability, but in the end, the truth had come out. Alan Briggs had paid the price for his greed. Precision Tech had taken steps to rebuild its reputation, and David had reclaimed his peace of mind. Though he had moved on to a different career, the experience served as a stark reminder of the importance of integrity in any field. For David, it was a story he would never forget, a tale of a fraudster's downfall and the resilience of those who stood up for what was right. It was a chilly autumn afternoon, and Sophie Allen was enjoying the sense of accomplishment as she put the finishing touches on a set of raised garden boxes alongside a rental property she owned. The house, located in a quiet college town in Missouri, was home to her stepsister Emily and 4 of her college friends. Sophie and her boyfriend, Liam, had purchased the property a year earlier, meticulously renovating it into a cozy home for the students. Sophie loved gardening and thought a few boxes of herbs and vegetables would be a perfect addition for the spring. The tranquility of the moment was soon interrupted by the sharp voice of a neighbor, Mrs. Gladys Winters, who everyone in the area knew simply as Gladys. She had lived in the neighborhood for decades and was infamous for her gossipy nature. Gladys often hovered near her windows, watching the comings and goings of the neighbors, and Sophie could feel her eyes on her even before Gladys approached. "Hello, dear," Gladys began with an overly saccharine tone as she shuffled up to Sophie. Sophie looked up and forced a polite smile, bracing herself for what she expected would be a long-winded conversation. "Hi, Mrs. Winters, how can I help you?" Sophie asked, standing to wipe her hands on her gardening gloves. "Oh, I just wanted to come over and say hello," Gladys replied. "It's such a lively house, isn't it? Always people coming and going. You must be very busy with it." Sophie tilted her head, sensing an ulterior motive. "It's a rental. My stepsister and her friends live here. College students, you know. Always something going on with school or group projects." Gladys stepped closer, her tone dropping to a hushed, conspiratorial whisper. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about, dear. I know you're just helping out here, but do you realize what this house really is?" Sophie raised an eyebrow. "I'm not sure what you mean." Gladys leaned in, looking around as if someone might overhear. "This house is a brothel." For a moment, Sophie was so taken aback she could only blink. "Excuse me? A brothel?" "Yes, dear. I've been watching this place for months, men coming and going at all hours, staying for a little while, then leaving." And last week, I saw a man come here to collect rent. When he left, 2 of those girls hugged him. Suspicious, isn't it?" Sophie stifled a laugh, realizing Gladys had mistaken her boyfriend Liam, who handled property maintenance and collected rent, for some sort of underworld figure. "Mrs. Winters, that man is my boyfriend Liam. He helps me manage the property, and the people coming and going are just their friends from school." Gladys wasn't convinced. 5 young women living in one house, men visiting constantly. I've been around long enough to know what's really going on here. I'd hate for something bad to happen to those girls, or for the police to get involved. I'm just trying to help, dear. Sophie sighed, forcing herself to stay calm. "Mrs. Winters, I assure you, this is a normal household. Nothing illegal is happening here." But Gladys wasn't ready to back down. "Well, I know the owner of this property. I'll be calling them to report this." Sophie finally allowed herself a small smirk. "You're speaking to the owner, Mrs. Winters. I own this property, so feel free to call me if you have any concerns." Gladys' face flushed as she stammered. "Oh well, I thought, you don't live here, do you? Where are you from?" "We live in St. Louis," Sophie replied curtly, already anticipating the dog whistle. As expected, Gladys's response carried a thinly veiled insinuation. "Well, you know what they say about people from the city." She trailed off, her eyes narrowing. Sophie had heard enough. "Mrs. Winters, I think we're done here. I have work to finish. Please don't harass my tenants." With that, Sophie returned to her garden boxes, but the interaction left her unsettled. As she packed up her tools an hour later, Emily came outside to chat. Emily's face fell when Sophie relayed the conversation. "She's been making snide comments for weeks," Emily said. "Stuff like 'bless your hearts' or telling us we need Jesus. We just try to ignore her." Sophie frowned. "If she keeps it up, let me know. We'll deal with it." Neither of them knew that Gladys had already retreated inside to make her 911 call, reporting Sophie and the house as a hub for illegal activities. For Sophie and her tenants, the day was far from over. As Sophie Allen finished loading her tools into the back of her truck, she felt a strange sense of unease, like a storm brewing just over the horizon. She brushed it off, attributing the feeling to her infuriating encounter with Gladys Winters, but just as she was about to get into the driver's seat, Emily burst out of the house, her face pale with worry. "Sophie, there's a police car pulling up in front of the house," Emily said, her voice laced with panic. Sophie turned and saw the unmistakable blue and red lights flickering against the twilight sky. 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser and approached the house, their expressions calm but professional. Sophie's stomach tightened. She knew immediately who was behind this. "Stay inside," Sophie told Emily, her tone firm. "I'll handle this." Sophie walked to meet the officers halfway, doing her best to project calm authority. "Good evening, officers. Is there something I can help you with?" One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a kind but serious demeanor, spoke first. "We received a call about potential illegal activity at this residence. The caller reported concerns about it being used for inappropriate purposes." Sophie exhaled sharply through her nose, fighting the urge to roll her eyes. "I think I can guess who made that call. I'm Sophie Allen, the owner of this property. I can assure you there's nothing illegal happening here." The second officer, a younger woman with a no-nonsense air, nodded. "We still need to take a look around and speak with the tenants." "Of course," Sophie said. "But first, let me show you something that might save us all some time." Sophie led the officers to her truck and pulled out her tablet, which was synced to the house's security system. She scrolled through the footage and quickly found the segment she needed. Gladys standing in her yard earlier that day, making exaggerated gestures toward the house while speaking animatedly on her phone. "This is Mrs. Gladys Winters, the neighbor who made the call," Sophie explained. "She's been harassing my tenants for weeks. She even accused me of running a brothel when I was outside building garden boxes." The officers watched the footage closely. It wasn't direct proof, but it did establish Gladys as the source of the complaint. The male officer's expression softened as he turned back to Sophie. "Mind if we speak with your tenants?" he asked. "Not at all," Sophie said. "Emily and her friends are inside. I'll let them know you're coming." Sophie returned to the house and explained the situation to Emily and the other tenants, who were already gathered in the living room, looking anxious. Emily nodded and stepped forward as the officers entered, ready to explain everything. She recounted the bizarre harassment they'd endured from Gladys, from passive-aggressive comments to outright accusations. The officers listened intently, occasionally taking notes. Then Emily pulled out her phone. "I actually recorded part of a conversation we had with her. Would you like to see it?" The younger officer perked up. Yes, please. Emily played the video, which showed Gladys standing on the sidewalk in broad daylight, wagging a finger at Emily and her friend. You girls are playing with fire, Gladys hissed in the video. I know what's going on here, and I won't stand for it. The officers exchanged a look. When the video ended, the male officer nodded approvingly. Thank you, Ms. Allen. That clears things up for us. The officers stepped outside to speak with Gladys, leaving Sophie, Emily, and the others gathered around the window. They watched as the officers knocked on Gladys's door, their presence seeming to catch her off guard. Gladys came to the door, her expression a mix of indignation and feigned innocence. Unfortunately, the conversation wasn't loud enough to overhear, but Gladys's exaggerated gestures and the occasional pointing towards Sophie's house were telling. After a few minutes, the officers turned and walked back to Sophie. We've given her a formal warning, the male officer said. She's been advised to stop harassing you and your tenants. If she contacts you again, call us immediately. Sophie felt a surge of relief. Thank you, officers. I appreciate your help. As the police car pulled away, Emily hugged Sophie tightly. I hope this is the end of it, Emily said, her voice wavering. But Sophie wasn't so sure. She knew Gladys's type. People who thrived on drama didn't just stop when confronted. They doubled down. And as the evening wore on, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that the night's peace was only temporary. Little did she know, Gladys wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The evening had settled into a crisp, quiet night. Inside the house, Sophie, Emily, and their friends gathered around the backyard fire pit, laughing and enjoying the warmth of the flames. Despite the earlier ordeal with the police, the atmosphere was lighthearted. They were determined not to let Gladys ruin their Thanksgiving gathering. The fire crackled as Liam, Sophie's boyfriend, added another log to the flames. Sophie was finally beginning to relax when a sudden, piercing yell shattered the calm. Everyone froze. What is going on back here? The group turned to see Gladys storming into the yard, her silhouette illuminated by the firelight. She was clutching a cane in one hand, waving it wildly as she barreled toward them. Her face was twisted in fury, her voice screeching accusations. You think you can get the police to shut me up? You think you can scare me? This house is nothing but a den of sin, and I won't stand for it, Gladys yelled, pointing her cane accusingly. The sheer absurdity of the situation left everyone momentarily stunned. But when Gladys began to close the distance between herself and the group, her cane raised, instincts kicked in. Freeze! Liam's voice boomed, honed from years in the Marines. He and Sophie, along with two other friends, drew their concealed carry firearms, leveling them at Gladys. Stop right there! Sophie shouted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Gladys froze mid-step, her eyes wide with shock. The sight of 4 handguns pointed at her was enough to cut through even her anger. Her cane wavered in the air before she slowly lowered it. Are you people insane? She shrieked, but her voice had lost its previous bravado. Get out of this yard, Liam said, his voice like stone. Turn around, slowly, go back to your house, and do not come back. Gladys hesitated for a moment, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for a retort. Finally, she turned and shuffled back toward her home, muttering under her breath. As soon as she disappeared into the darkness, Sophie holstered her weapon and pulled out her phone. That's it, she said, her voice tight with anger. I'm calling the police again. Within minutes, the same officers who had responded earlier were back, their flashing lights illuminating the street. This time, Gladys didn't wait for them to knock. She stormed out of her house, her words tumbling out in a frantic tirade. They pulled guns on me! They were going to shoot me! This is a lawless house full of criminals! I won't stand for this! The officers raised their hands, motioning for her to calm down, but Gladys continued ranting. They fired at me! I heard gunshots! Sophie stepped forward, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Gladys's hysteria. Officers, we have everything on video. Our security system caught the entire incident, and I'll be happy to show you the footage. One of the officers nodded. Let's take a look. Sophie led them to the doorbell camera monitor, where they watched as Gladys charged into the yard, waving her cane aggressively. The footage clearly showed her as the instigator, and there were no signs of gunfire. The officers exchanged a look, then walked back to Gladys, who was still sputtering about her innocence. Mrs. Winters, the lead officer said, his tone firm. You're under arrest for criminal trespassing and menacing. What? You can't arrest me! I'm the victim here! Gladys shrieked, but the officers were unmoved. They cuffed her as she continued to protest, her voice growing fainter as she was led to the squad car. Back at the house, the group watched the scene unfold from the window. Emily let out a shaky laugh. "I can't believe that just happened." Liam shook his head. "Honestly, she's lucky no one got hurt. Charging into someone's yard like that in the dark, she's fortunate this didn't end worse." The officers returned to the house briefly to assure the group that the situation was under control. Before leaving, they handed Sophie a card and said, "If you have any more trouble with her, or anyone else, don't hesitate to call." The drama seemed to finally be over, but the next day brought one final twist. Sophie received a call from Gladys's landlord, who had heard about the incident. "I need your help," the landlord explained. "I'm filing for eviction, and I need a statement from you about her harassment and what happened last night." Sophie was more than happy to oblige. She provided the landlord with the video evidence and a detailed affidavit of Gladys's behavior. It felt like poetic justice to know that her reign of terror was coming to an end. As the week went on, the neighborhood grew noticeably quieter. Word spread that Gladys had been unable to post bail and was being held until her court hearing. For Sophie, Emily, and the others, life returned to normal, finally free from the shadow of the nosy neighbor who had taken her entitlement too far. Sophie sat by the fire pit a few nights later, enjoying the calm. Justice, she thought, had been served. And that wraps up today's episode of Threads of Kindness. From a chaotic Thanksgiving night to a long overdue reckoning in the business world, these stories show how courage and determination can lead to justice. If you liked what you heard, hit that thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible tales of resilience and truth. Remember, even in the midst of chaos, there's always an opportunity to make things right. See you next time.